We saw in the last part of the lesson how to solve equations that had absolute values and really nothing else around the absolute value. In the event that there is another operation or two around the absolute value, we have a responsibility to get the absolute value by itself before we attempt to solve. And this really goes back to the logic that we mentioned in the last video. If we want the absolute value to equal a particular number, it needs to be the only thing that's there. For this example, we don't want to have to say to ourselves, I need the absolute value of 4x minus 6 plus another 2 to equal 22. If I really want to simplify this process for myself, I'm going to subtract that 2 away from the left side of the equation, and I'm going to end up with an equation that looks like this. This is a much easier interpretation. I need 4x minus 6 to have an absolute value of 20. And employing the same logic that we employed previously, there's two ways to get there. 4x minus 6 can have an absolute value of 20 if it equals 20, or 4x minus 6 can have an absolute value of 20 if it equals negative 20. Solving each one of these equations, on the left equation, I'll add 6 and divide by 4, and I'll end up with 13 over 2, also known as 6.5. And solving the right equation, and I'm going to end up with x is negative 7 over 2, or negative 3.5. That one minor little step of removing this 2 from the left side of the equation, and incidentally also from the right side, made it so I could split the absolute value and get these two different answers. Remember, for the absolute value equations, we're going to have these two answers more times than not, because we have two different ways to create that result with the absolute value. In this case, we had two different ways to get an absolute value of 20. We either could have been 20 or we could have been negative 20. Similarly, in this example, we'll engage in the same practice. We have two numbers this time around the absolute value. We have the 4 that's in front of the absolute value and the minus 8 that's after. In these cases, we're going to want to follow the same logic that we would follow anytime we solved an equation. Normally, when we're solving an equation and we engage in the inverse operations in reverse, we would get rid of subtraction and then multiplication. We'll do the same thing here. We'll begin by adding 8 over to the right-hand side, and then we'll divide by 4, and we end up with the absolute value of 7y plus 2 is equal to 1/4. We are not alarmed by the fact that that is a fractional answer. We can still be a fractional difference, not a fractional answer, but a fractional absolute value result. We're not alarmed by that fact. We can be a fractional distance away from 0. We can be 1/4 of a unit away from 0. So how can I get my absolute value to come out as 1/4? I can be either 1/4 or I can be negative 1/4. If I'm 1/4, I'll subtract 2 and divide by 7, and you can certainly check this algebra if you'd like, but y will equal negative 1/4. And over here on the right, this one's going to end up a little bit more complicated despite its obvious similarity to the last example. Here we're going to end up with y is equal to negative 9/28. Again, you'll want to go through the effort of checking these two solutions to make sure they're correct and that they work. That's not, like I've mentioned in previous videos, that's not an issue anytime. You can check them anytime you want. It can be a regular equation, it can be an absolute value equation, and we'll have many more equations during this course that you'll be able to go back substitute in and solve. But the reality is that you really want to convince yourself of the answers. If you are convinced that you did these two steps up here correctly, then the back substitution can just happen right there. You don't have to do anything more complicated than looking at that individual line and saying, well, what if I did 7 times negative 9/28 plus 2? And convince yourself that that absolute value is going to come out to be 1/4. And in this case, it does. So you want to be conscientious of the fact that these answers should really be checked anytime, but especially in those cases where there might be an extra occurrence of the variable floating around on the right.